In the brutal winter of 1867, construction foreman Samuel Hartwell sent what would be his final telegraph from the Union Pacific's Camp 17, buried deep in Utah's Wasatch Mountains. The message was just 7 words: supply shortages critical, men eating each other. 3 days later, rescuers finally reached the isolated camp, forcing their way through 12 feet of snow. The cook fires were still burning. Massive iron cauldrons simmered with steaming stew. But of the 127 men who had been stationed there, only 18 were still alive. They weren't gathered by the warmth of the fire. They were huddled together in the supply shed, eyes wide with terror, refusing to speak about how they had survived that winter. Within hours, the railroad company sealed every record of Camp 17. For over a century, the families of the missing workers were told the same lie, that their loved ones had simply wandered off into the wilderness. But newly uncovered company correspondence reveals something far worse. A horror so deliberate, so orchestrated, it rivals anything in the darkest corners of America's westward expansion. Camp 17 was born from ambition and greed. In September of 1867, it stood in a narrow, wind-scoured valley at over 8,000 feet, surrounded by peaks of solid granite. Its purpose was simple: force a rail line through some of the most dangerous terrain in the Wasatch Range. The Union Pacific Railroad, locked in a high-stakes race against the Central Pacific, had pushed construction further into the mountains than any sane engineer would dare. The incentive, $48,000 in government subsidies for every mile of track laid through mountain country, nearly triple the rate for the plains. There was nothing hospitable about the site. Canvas tents and rough barracks clung to the valley floor. The thunder of dynamite echoed endlessly as crews blasted through stone that had stood untouched since before human memory. The men came from everywhere: Irish immigrants escaping famine, Civil War veterans scarred by Gettysburg and Antietam, freed slaves chasing opportunity in a land where a man's worth was measured by his endurance, not his skin. They worked for $2.50 a day when the wages actually arrived. Leading them was Samuel Hartwell, a former Union Army quartermaster with a steel-gray stare that seemed to measure and catalog everything in sight. His right hand was Thomas Quincaid, a towering Irishman with the strength to swing a 20-pound sledgehammer for 12 hours and still break up a fight at night. And in the cook tent, Wilhelm Brina, German immigrant whose precision in the kitchen bordered on obsession. His pale blue eyes followed each man as if he were taking inventory, like a butcher sizing livestock. By October, trouble was already spreading. Supply trains that once came weekly were now arriving every 2 or 3 weeks, half empty when they did. Company executives in Omaha sent clipped telegrams blaming logistical adjustments, their words laced with irritation, as if expecting food in a Utah winter was unreasonable. With gain driven off by the thunder of blasting, the men were left to fight over scraps. Rations fell from 3 meals a day to 2, then to 1. They foraged what they could: pine needles, bitter herbs, but the mountains offered nothing more. Hunger twisted the camp. Arguments turned to fights. Songs and laughter around the fires gave way to silence, as men watched each other's portions with cold calculation, counting every bite even as hunger and cold sank deeper into the bones. Of Camp 17, the demands from Union Pacific headquarters never stopped. Every day, fresh telegrams arrived, cold words tapped out from warm offices ordering progress reports, threatening wage cuts, even promising to replace the crew if productivity fell. The quotas never changed. Rock removal, track laying, same numbers, no matter that the men were half-starved, shivering in sub-zero winds, and swinging frozen metal tools that burned their hands with every strike. To the company, they were still machines, expected to work as if the mountain winter didn't exist. The first death came on November 23, 1867. Patrick Sullivan, 24 years old. County Cork was one of the most liked men in camp. That day, He was placing blasting charges into a stubborn granite face they'd been working for 2 weeks. Without warning, the mountain exploded. Tons of rock sheared off and came crashing down, shaking the valley like thunder from hell. They dug for an hour, maybe more. His screams grew weaker, then stopped. When they found him, there was nothing left to save. Every bone shattered. His body flattened beneath the weight of stone, organs reduced to pulp that stained the snow dark. His face, the same face that had once laughed and sung Irish songs, was now unrecognizable. The men stood in frozen silence, speaking only of how to bury him in ground that had been ice-locked for weeks. Then Wilhelm Briner, the camp's cook, stepped forward. His pale blue eyes didn't look shocked. They looked calculating. The same look he gave a side of beef on delivery day, kneeling beside Sullivan's mangled corpse. Briner examined him with the slow precision of a butcher. "There's still good meat here," he said in his thick German accent. "Waste not, want not. That's what we learned during the siege of Vicksburg." The men stared, horrified. Thomas Kincaid, the giant Irish foreman, was the first to speak. "Jesus Christ, Wilhelm, you can't be serious." But Brina never stopped working. "I've served horse meat to cavalry, rat stew to siege survivors, even boiled leather to men who would have died otherwise. This is fresher than anything we've had in weeks." And Patrick was a healthy young man. His voice carried no madness, no shame, only the matter-of-fact tone of a man solving a problem. Now, the decision was Samuel Hartwell's. As foreman, he could shut this down, preserve what was left of their humanity. But the truth was brutal. The last supply train was 3 weeks late. What little food remained might last 10 days maybe. The mountain passes wouldn't open until spring. The railroad had abandoned them. Winter was tightening its fist. 126 men were looking to Hartwell to keep them alive. The snow began to fall, fat and heavy, settling over Sullivan's blood. The silence stretched, and then Hartwell gave the smallest nod. 2 hours later, Patrick Sullivan's flesh was simmering in the evening stew, diced small and heavily seasoned with wild herbs. Briner's skill disguised the origin just enough potatoes and onions to mask the taste and texture. Most men refused at first, bowls untouched as they stared into the fire, wrestling with morality. But by morning, every bowl was scraped clean. Some even asked Briner if more of this mountain game might be found. That night, new sounds came from the cook tent, sounds the survivors would hear again and again in the weeks ahead. The steady thunk of a cleaver, the scrape of knife on bone, Briner's voice, humming old German folk songs, while the fire crackled and water splashed as he scrubbed his tools to a perfect shine. By breakfast, the porridge came with mountain sausage, dense links with a texture no one recognized, but a flavor that silenced their doubts. Hunger has a way of making men forget. The sausages were spiced and seasoned so well, no one could have guessed their true origin. Men even complimented Briner on his skill, how he could conjure such hearty meals from scraps. And slowly, almost without notice, Camp 17 began to change. Like a slow-acting poison, something spread through the men, not in their blood, but in their thinking. Within days of Patrick Sullivan's death, energy returned to the crew. The gnawing hunger that had haunted them for weeks eased. They moved with vigor, despite the snow, the wind, the thin air. And Briner was no longer just the camp's cook. He had become something more. A figure the men sought out not just for food, but for counsel. Men deferred to his judgment on disputes, even work assignments. He walked the camp with the confidence of a man who knew exactly who was in control. His pale eyes always assessing, measuring each man the way a butcher weighs meat. When asked how he kept them fed despite the supply crisis, Briner would smile, tap his temple, and murmur, "Waste not, want not. There's always more, if you know where to look, and you're not squeamish about opportunity." The second death came on December 7th. Marcus Holloway, a seasoned railroad man from Ohio, collapsed while hauling timber. No gruesome accident this time, just a sudden clutching of the chest, and he was gone before the camp doctor could help him. His death was a blow to morale. Marcus carried decades of knowledge that couldn't be replaced. But this time, there was no hesitation, no debate. Before anyone could speak of burial, Briner was already sharpening his knives. The men didn't protest. Some even helped carry the body to his work tent, as if this was now simply procedure. Marcus was a good worker, Briner said, working with an ease that spoke of practice. He'd want to keep helping the crew, in the only way he still can. His hands moved faster now, surer. What had taken hours with Sullivan's mangled remains took barely one with Holloway's intact body and yielded more meat, better quality. Nothing went to waste. Even the organs found their way into the pot. By evening, the stew was rich, the seasoning sharper, the texture improved. Men ate without reluctance. Some even praised the new flavor and asked if more of the same ingredients could be found. Cannibalism had become a dinner conversation, masked in the language of taste and texture, as if they were restaurant patrons, not starving laborers. But Foreman Hartwell had started seeing something, a pattern. Deaths were coming in intervals 10 to 12 days apart, always timed for when Briner's special provisions began to run low, and hunger returned. And the men, they had changed. They no longer saw each other as comrades in hardship, but as potential threats or potential resources. Conversations were cautious. Eyes lingered too long on the weak. The third death confirmed it. On December 19th, Seamus O'Brien, a healthy, strong 28-year-old, was found dead. The story was that he'd slipped on ice carrying blasting powder, hitting his head on granite. But when Thomas Quincaid examined the scene, the details didn't add up. The ice patch was undisturbed. The blood pattern showed the fatal blows came while O'Brien was lying on the ground. Someone had beaten him to death. Quincaid took his findings to Hartwell. The foreman's answer was short and chilling. He ordered Quincaid to keep quiet and help Briner with preparations for the evening meal. That night, the men gathered around the cook fires, bowls in hand, their faces bright with anticipation. And in that firelight, for the few still able to see clearly, the truth became undeniable. They were no longer just survivors making desperate compromises. They were something else. Now, by the turn of the year, they were no longer just a crew fighting to survive. They had become participants in a system of deliberate, scheduled killing timed with precision to keep the camp's food supply steady through a winter that felt endless. Camp 17 had become a sealed laboratory of human degradation. No contact with the outside world, no chance of rescue, no hope but what they could carve from each other's flesh. And in that isolation, ordinary men were reshaped into something unrecognizable, something that mocked the very idea of civilized society. By January, the camp's leadership, Quincaid and Briner, were running more than a railroad crew. They were running an operation. Every 10 days, without fail, Briner appeared at the morning meal with his nutrition assessment, clipboard in hand, pale eyes cold. He inspected each man, his health, his productivity, his friendships. Those who had no allies, those whose bodies showed weakness, were marked. Assignments followed, dangerous ones. Work alone in an unstable tunnel. Haul timbers across the icy cliff path. Handle unstable explosives where one wrong move meant a quick death. On the surface, it all looked like the usual hazards of the job, but the pattern was clear. Each accident claimed a man who would be least missed, and whose absence wouldn't upset morale. On January 2nd, it was Friedrich Kallara, young German immigrant, already isolated by language and culture, who was lost. They said he'd slipped while checking survey markers on dangerous footing, found at the bottom of a ravine. The camp mourned, briefly, and then Briner arrived, as expected, with his tools and his routine. By now, no one questioned it. His presence at a death scene was as natural as a doctor at a sick bed, and with each body, his techniques, sharpened, refined, perfected. The camp's soul had shifted. Once, men shared letters from home, stories by the fire. Now, conversation was stripped down to work schedules, tool repairs, mechanical words from men who had stopped being human to each other. Evenings were silent, save for the sound of chewing. No songs, no laughter, just the feeding of animals at a trough. Quincaid, once just Hartwell's muscle, had grown into something more dangerous. He enjoyed the process, watching, waiting, drawing men in before marking them for death. When young Daniel McCarthy began to weaken in mid-January, his eyes sunken, hands trembling, Quincaid moved in, offered to help with the heavy loads, became his companion, his friend. 3 days later, McCarthy was dead, crushed beneath a load of timber, Quincaid right there to witness the accident. The timing was perfect, supplies low, hunger high, and another body on Breener's table. Even Dr. Edwin Cartwright, the camp's medical officer, had once tried to record the truth, taking careful notes, pointing out inconsistencies. But by late January, even he was broken. Survival had stripped away the oaths and the ethics. When Giuseppe Bellacorti died on January 24, injuries that didn't match the story, Cartwright just wrote death by misadventure in his log, and helped carry the corpse to the cook tent. By now, mealtime wasn't dreaded. It was celebrated. Men who had once gagged at the thought now looked forward to Breener's creations, even requesting certain cuts or flavors. He had an entire menu of ways to disguise the taste and texture of human meat. The fire pits had become his restaurant, and the crew his willing patrons. But the first crack in this facade came in early. February. Kazmia Kowalska, Polish immigrant. Once a university student, had both the education and the moral clarity to see the truth for what it was. While scavenging in an abandoned equipment shed, he found something hidden under loose floorboards, a stash of personal effects, watches, rings, photographs, letters, belongings from dozens of men the camp claimed had wandered off or died in accidents. It was a graveyard without bodies, and it told the real story of Camp 17's dwindling numbers. Among Kowalski's discoveries was the most damning evidence yet. Pages in Breener's own handwriting, neat, methodical notes, cataloging each victim, height, weight, estimated meat, yield, preparation method. It read less like a cook's log and more like a scientific study, human butchery refined into an experiment. Which cuts produced the best results? Which methods delivered the richest flavor? Kowalski began, keeping his own secret record, half in Polish, half in English, documenting not just the killings, but the way the camp's psychology had twisted into something unrecognizable. February 8. One entry read, "They took Michelson today. The poor Swedish boy never had a chance once Quincaid marked him. Found him with his skull crushed. Breener sharpening his knives before the body was even cold. We'll eat well tonight. And tomorrow, the cycle begins again." Hidden in our papers, Kowalski found something worse. Letters to railroad officials, full of lies. Missing men were reported as deserters, not dead. The company avoided responsibility. And, buried between the lines, there were hints. Mentions of alternative food sources. Creative resource management. This wasn't desperation-born cannibalism. It was planned. And the company knew by February. The camp had split into two worlds. The inner circle, Hartwell, Quincaid, Breener, and a handful of loyalists openly discussed their feeding schedule. They spoke of selecting the weak. In their minds, it wasn't murder, it was management. Survival of the fittest. Social Darwinism, Breener lectured like a professor. Each man we process makes us stronger, he told them. Conditions that would destroy lesser men only make us more resilient. They kept records rating the quality of each kill, noting how different bodies affected their energy, mood, even morale. Breener experimented with smoking and salting human meat supplies that could last weeks, even months, between kills. The outer circle, the rest, lived in pure fear. sleeping in shifts, keeping watch, terrified that fatigue or isolation might mark them as next. Alliances formed and crumbled because the math was brutal. More allies meant more mouths to feed. More mouths meant a shorter food supply. Cooperate and starve, resist and die. On February 14th, a breaking point, Brian Donnelly, Irish-born, couldn't take it any longer. He called Hartwell's group murdering bastards and began rallying a resistance. 12 men joined him, clinging to whatever humanity they still had. They gathered weapons, made plans, overthrow the leadership, escape through the mountains, or at least survive without killing each other. But Brenner had informants, men so dependent on the system that they saw rebellion as a threat to their survival. Before dawn, Kincaid led the strike, a swift, brutal sweep. By the time it was over, Donnelly and 4 others were executed, not killed in a fight. The survivors faced a choice: join the inner circle and take part in the killings, or be processed themselves. 7 men joined. 1 refused. Kazimierz Kowalski would not kill, but he would continue to eat. His role as chronicler kept him alive barely. His diary, found decades later in his grandson's belongings, became the clearest account of Camp 17's descent into organized cannibalism, a place where the line between human and animal had been erased entirely. By late February, Camp 17 was no longer just a work camp. It was an operation. The inner circle Hartwell Kincaid Brenner had perfected it, and now they gave it a name. The roster, a list. Every man ranked top of the list safe, for now. At the bottom, days, maybe hours left to live. Everyone knew where they stood. Everyone knew their turn would come. Brenner's cook tent had become something far darker, a slaughterhouse, organized with a precision that would have impressed any professional butcher. Different knives for different cuts, hooks for hanging, a system to catalog every body by age, condition, yield. Young men, tender meat, minimal seasoning. Older ones, tough flesh, slow cooking, heavy spice, to hide the taste. His notes were experiments, testing which organs gave the most strength, which cooking preserved vitamins, even theories on whether eating certain body parts could give psychological advantages. It was murder disguised as research, and the killings were changing the mountain itself. The constant smell of roasting flesh brought wolves, bears, larger, hungrier predators than the men had ever seen in these parts. The ecosystem had shifted. Hartwell's lies to the railroad continued. Telegrams spoke of steady progress, desertions instead of deaths, weather problems instead of starvation, and in the language of corporate coldness, the officials hinted they understood and didn't care. Phrases like resource management and creative problem-solving buried in their replies. Inside the camp, control was absolute. Privileges for loyalty, isolation for doubt, better rations, warmer sleeping quarters. For those who smiled at the system, and for those who hesitated, a place at the bottom of the roster. It wasn't enough to tolerate cannibalism anymore. You had to embrace it. March 3rd, 1868. After 5 months, salvation appeared on the horizon. The supply train, it should have been joy. Instead it was panic. Hartwell saw the truth instantly. The bodies, the preserved meat. Fewer than 40 survivors from the original 127, and most of them broken hollow-eyed shells. If the railroad men saw this, the gallows would follow. Brenner's solution was cold, fast, and final. We eliminate all witnesses before the train arrives. Claim they died in the winter storms. No one will question it. 30 men, gone, in less than a day. Hartwell looked around the room. We're all in this together. Either we erase the evidence, or we hang for it. March 5th, dawn. Hours before the train's whistle would echo through the pass, the killing began. The inner circle moved through the camp like a silent storm, axes, hammers, whatever they could find. Men died in their bunks, never opening their eyes. Blood soaking into the frozen ground, disappearing under fresh snow. They never saw it coming. The victims weak, from months of hunger, and shattered in mind, were no match for the men who had fed on human flesh all winter. Kazimier's diary reads like a witness to hell. The screaming started just after sunrise, echoing off the mountains like the cries of the damned. He saw Briner shouting orders, "Clean it up. Leave no witnesses." From behind the supply shed, he watched them drag bodies to the fires, not to cook, to erase. The plan was simple: burn the remains, destroy the tools, present themselves as the heroes who had survived an unthinkable winter. But there was too much. Too many bodies, too much evidence, and the survivors. Their eyes told the truth, before their mouths did. Railroad detectives would see it. They would ask questions. So Hartwell's inner circle made a final choice. A new lie, they would claim. An Indian attack, 109 men, gone, killed, and carried away in some imagined tribal ritual. It was a story tailor-made for the prejudices of the time, and it might have worked. March 1868, when the supply train pulled in, they found 18 gaunt men, huddled together in the supply shed. Hartwell stood tall, spinning his tale of siege and heroism. Briner's cook tent-scrubbed clean-held rows of preserved meat, explained away as wild game. For a moment, it worked, but Company Detective Harrison Vale wasn't buying it. A former Union Army intelligence officer, Vale had seen liars before, and these men were hiding something. He separated them, pressed them, and one by one, the cracks appeared. Whispers became confessions. Confessions became testimony. And then, Kowalski's diary was found. Every detail, the schedule, the selection process, the planning sessions. It wasn't desperation. It was design. The official investigation lasted just 2 weeks, and then it vanished. Union Pacific executives shut it down. No trials, no public scandal. They scattered the survivors to remote work sites under gag orders. Hartwell got a desk job in Omaha. Kincaid vanished, likely on company money, and Briner, a man matching his description, bought a ticket to South America cash in hand. Families of the missing 109 received form letters, claims of winter accidents, Indian attacks, alongside small compensation payments, hush money in all but name, records burned, telegrams destroyed, Camp 17 erased from history. Almost Casimir Kowalski, the man whose diary ripped the truth out of Camp 17, never walked free again. The official story: a nervous breakdown, committed to an asylum in Chicago, dead. 3 years later, unofficially, whispers said he'd been poisoned, silenced, so his words could never reach the wrong ears. But Detective Harrison Vale, he'd made a copy, hidden it away. Evidence, insurance, for a day when the truth might be allowed to breathe. When Vale died in 1889, that copy resurfaced, the clearest, most complete record of Camp 17's transformation into an industrial machine for murder and cannibalism. The railroad erased the rest with industrial efficiency. The site declared geologically unstable, equipment dismantled, barracks and cook tent obliterated in controlled explosions by 1870. It was gone. Even the maps were rewritten. Camp 17 vanished from every official record. But you can't erase the minds of men. And some talked. Scattered survivors broke their gag orders, told pieces of the story, and were dismissed as madmen, their words buried under myths of Indian attacks and frontier hardship. And then, they started disappearing, one by one. Some bought off, others dealt with permanently. In 1923, railroad historian Margaret Hensley found the cracks in the wall, letters hidden deep in company archives, proof the cover-up was real. She tried to publish, the company shut her down. Trade secrets, national security. When she died in 1954, her files told the whole story, how corporate ambition and cold profit turned a remote work camp into a slaughterhouse, and buried the evidence for generations. Today, Camp 17 sleeps under a federal reservoir, the water hiding whatever bones the blasts left behind. Trains still roll over those mountains, steel laid on the backs and the bodies of 109 men, and the Union Pacific Railroad, now a billion-dollar giant, has never admitted it happened. Camp 17's truth isn't about monsters in the dark. It's about ordinary people, driven past the edge by hunger, isolation, and a system that valued steel rails over human lives. A truth the railroad proved can be buried forever, if the right hands control the story. So what do you think? Was everything revealed? Or are there still secrets buried deep beneath the black water, where Camp 17 once stood?